Good afternoon. I am Melissa Anderson, and I am pleased to welcome you to the inaugural lecture in honor of Nick Steneck and Tony Meyer. Many of you know Nick and Tony as the founders of the World Conferences on Research Integrity. But maybe you don't know exactly how it all began. Nick, a professor of history at the University of Michigan in the US, was also working as a consultant to the US Office of Research Integrity. He had organized research integrity conferences, and he thought it would be a great idea to have a joint conference with participants from the US and mainly European countries. So he visited many offices in Europe to propose this idea, and everywhere people responded enthusiastically, yes, yes, great idea. And we can't give you any money. That is, until he went to the European Science Foundation. There he met Bertil Anderson, who was at the time ESF's chief executive officer. Bertil was enthusiastic like the others, but he also said, I will give you funding, and he said, you should work with our chef de cabinet and head of strategy, Tony Meyer. That was the start of the conferences and the beginning of a deep and valued friendship between Nick and Tony. One could not really imagine a better team. Nick knew all about research integrity, and Tony knew all the right people. Their emails to me about these remarks I'm making right now illustrate their collaborative relationship. Nick wrote, I had an idea, a small one. Tony and Bertil had bigger ideas. And then Tony wrote, no, Nick is far too modest. The whole concept was his. We just helped him run with it. By the time of the first conference in Lisbon, Portugal, in 2007, the conference had grown beyond the US-European scope, and it was called the World Conference on Research Integrity. Notice I did not say the first World Conference. That was because it was originally planned as a single event. But one of the outcomes of the Lisbon meeting was the decision to have another, and then another, and then another, and here we are at the 6th World Conference. Nick and Tony did not just set the gears in motion, they imprinted the conferences with their ideas, such as involve people from many countries and from many sectors associated with research integrity, maintain a broad focus on research integrity instead of a narrow focus on scientific misconduct, promote discussion and exchange represented, for example, in the development of the Singapore Statement, which was released as part of the Second World Conference. What followed was years of work and collaboration with many, many others in shaping and building the World Conferences. Nick and Tony are right here in the front, and I invite them to stand and receive our appreciation. The story of how the World Conferences got started and grew will be told through the Oral History Project, which is now underway by members of the board of the World Conferences Foundation. The project involves filmed interviews with those who directed the first 5 conferences. The final film will appear on the Foundation's website, along with several written histories as well. And so, it is fitting that the World Conference Board hereby institutes the Steneck-Mayer Lecture, which will be part of every succeeding conference. According to the board's guidance, the lecture is intended to bring in a somewhat different perspective on research integrity, with ideas on how we should move forward in this field. And so, I am delighted to introduce our speaker, Mark McMillan. Professor McMillan is a Wiradjuri man from Trangie, Australia. He is a professor and Deputy Vice-Chancellor for Indigenous Education and Engagement at RMIT University. He received the Master of Laws and Doctor of Juridical Science degrees from the University of Arizona in the U.S. He's been a researcher and practitioner in Wiradjuri and Western law for 25 years. Professor McMillan has been on the Human Research Ethics Committee of the Australian Institute for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies. Finally, he is a director of the National Indigenous Research and Knowledge Network and a member of the Australian Research Council's College of Experts. Please welcome Mark McMillan.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Melissa. I also would like to acknowledge Nick and Tony in whose honour, and given that you're rock star welcome, I'm not sure I can emulate that, but what I want to do is to honour what you bring and really about how we think about what perspectives need to be brought into what is being characterised as something new, when really what we understand is something very old. And when we talk about old, we're not just merely talking about a couple of thousands of years. The practices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nations in Australia, through Western ideas of science, has been validated as a practice going back 120,000 years. And there's a lot of practices, scientific and otherwise, that would suggest that our engagement in our societies has led to the practices of research integrity that fundamentally supports and sustains not just us as the world's oldest living cultures, but also us as the oldest, longest practicing researchers. But before I go on, I also must honour Dr. Paul Taylor, who not only is a colleague, he inspired me and a lot of other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who were engaged with this idea of research ethics and research integrity to actually think about what we offer for newly constructed conceptions of research integrity. And it's something that I'm proud to say that not only was Paul a friend, he was also an inspiration, and it's in his passing that I acknowledge the profound effect that the practice of people like Paul has on a lot of other people, and in particular me. I also want to recognise Dan Barr and Dr. Dan Barr from RMIT and Professor Callum Drummond, who is the Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Research and Innovation and Vice President of RMIT, and I only call that out because he's my boss, so he paid for the bills. But he's also, both of these men have also inspired us to actually think about what is the purpose of bringing Indigenous knowledge systems into Western ideas of relationality and relationship rather than merely consumption of knowledge. And put that in an ethical frame. So really, for us, it isn't about what non-Indigenous people, Western conceptions of knowledge is, or Western conceptions of research and what it does. But for us in Indigenous knowledge ways, it is actually, we understand that there's a different way to look at research knowledge, and how that informs knowledge systems. And rather than just saying it's an advancement of knowledge, it builds on knowledge systems that are already there. And so it's not merely just let's do stuff in an ethical framework. And one of the things that we talk about, which is the idea that research is only conducted for social good. And when we talk about social good It isn't merely the advancement of humanity looking forward, but it's actually what is the foundation of which we have and continue to build on research and knowledge. And people working in universities and knowledge producers, this idea that advancement of knowledge is new knowledge, it's really not. There are some new ways of knowing the world, but again, that is always built back on the practice of something else. It's always referenced within a framework. There's an understanding of what disciplines do. Disciplines are an arrangement of knowledge systems that support a larger system called a society. And so these practices that we do aren't necessarily just in or for the sake of advancing knowledge of itself, which is an impossibility. And we've practiced all of these controls on what happens when knowledge just is advanced for its own sake. It very quickly gets put into an ethical framework or a broader understanding of knowledge, and an information system or a knowledge system gets put around it. It doesn't exist of itself. And we can think about where we've got extremes of those things. Some knowledge is absolutely new. Sometimes we don't know what to do with it. But we also know as things start to move that once you start to put ethical bounds around those knowledge systems, it draws it back into a relationality of other ways of knowing that thing or other ways of knowing the effect of that thing. Because there are some technologies, there are some advances in knowledge that maybe are not good, or the ones that are not good, we actually start to say, really, we push through that and we always bring it back to, is this good for humanity or is this good for the society of which it's developed? Now, we do know that some things ultimately are not good for the whole of societies, humanity, but we've also got a research framework that actually brings us back into, well, what are we going to do with the things that we know might lead to sort of some problems? But this is where we start to think about, well, what does Indigenous knowledge systems do? And I'm talking specifically about the place, the planet itself, that supports what is old with what is new. And so, like a good nerdy lawyer and a good nerdy academic lawyer, I've prepared a whole lot of slides. And now that I'm reading them, I'm looking at them on the screen going, which is why I'm wearing my glasses. You're really not interested in this, are you? What you're interested in is, we know that we've got to trust research. We know that we actually have senses of integrity. But there's a particular way that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nations use or mean when we actually reference integrity. It is, what is the wholeness of our life ways? Not merely what is data, what is information, and how do we actually construct it. Integrity means, how do we sustain, maintain, and fulfil not just the ambition of our nations, but also how do we sustain the very thing that is as old as time itself, which is us. So when we get to, this is the map that I wanted you to see. For the Australians in the audience, hopefully you've seen this once or twice, but for everybody else, this is the Aboriginal nations, the First Peoples of Australia. We don't just have one Aboriginal population, we don't just have one Torres Strait Islander population or native population, however you want to construct it. As the Aboriginal peoples of Australia, every one of those colours is an Indigenous knowledge system. My nation, which is over to the right-hand side as you're looking at it, is one of the bigger blobs down in the bottom, Wiradjuri Nation. But what this suggests is the myth that there is one set of practices that all native peoples in Australia, all Aboriginal peoples in Australia hold. Each one of those colours, those territories, are a distinctive knowledge system and have been practiced for, as I said, up to 120,000 years, without interruption, but with a lot of evolution and adaptation. Everybody wants to think that our knowledge systems were fundamentally broken when ships arrived in 1788 and developed a new way of actually wiping out what was already there. When in fact, when you think about it, 240 years ago compared to 120,000 years of practice of people kept arriving all the time. There wasn't a Big Bang theory and all of a sudden we were 340 distinct language groups or that we were distinctive nations. It was the evolution over time as a cradle of humanity that allowed us to practice relationships around knowledge of place that is not just validated, it actually becomes a way that we can understand practice of knowledge itself. And the reason that we still exist today in this form, there is no doubt that the colonial project had an effect on how we practiced and sustained our knowledge systems, but read or listen to what I'm saying, merely had an effect, did not wipe it out. So what that means is even 240 years ago, and for a lot of people in this auditorium that have had the practices of tens of thousands of years with place, you will know that there is always and has always been the ability, the desire, the requirement for knowledge systems to constantly adapt and evolve with modernity as modernity was happening. Is that my time already? Oh, good. It's like, gee, that was quick. I know I can talk underwater with rocks in my mouth, but that frightened me that it was a little bit too early. But what we have been able to show, not merely through storytelling, but through practice, is that we have created knowledge that has persisted and evolved over deep time. You know, I've been studied in the US where heard this thing called the Bering Strait theory, which was, Native Americans only came when there was the sea bridge was in place, and all of those things they're unsettling because what it is seeking to do is say, there's a lot of people who don't practice over time knowledge systems. It doesn't matter where people have come from. It is what and how they have been able to adapt knowledge over time with that place. And using those practices sustained those systems, those societies themselves. So that's what we mean by what we think we are recognising, because we still talk about research integrity and research ethics as a new phenomenon. It's a recent one for this modernity. But there's a whole lot of people who've practiced modernity for a long time. And one of those things that we look at, which is how do we look and how do we notice, how do we practice evolution of knowledge? But how do we do that with integrity? Because there's a lot of people who think that Indigenous knowledge is mere mythology or cultural, or because it's not based in a Western conception of knowledge and knowledge construction. And if we go back to even this idea of what it is to be old in Western ideas of itself, you go, there's a whole lot of practices that are in place that excluded other ways of knowing and being with place. And so really what Nick and Tony, and I'm looking at them both directly, have invited is, how do we actually practice these knowledge systems wherever they are, have evolved over time with those places, including Western knowledge systems. So, or Western ways of knowing knowledge. And when I say Western, that's not to say that there aren't many ways, but when we actually think of the places where I have been, this interplay between Western knowledge and Indigenous knowledge systems is something to remind us about it's always a practice. And then when we think of multiculturalism, multi-sites of knowledge, you can start to understand that really modernity is allowing us to not just consume other ways of knowing, but to construct the relationships in which knowledge systems know each other, not as merely consumptive or inclusive. But it's a bit like this weird level, I don't know where a lot of the rest of the world is, but in Australia we talk a lot about multidisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity, and the importance of disciplines and across knowledge systems having an effect on each other. And so instead of having to consume disciplines or devour disciplines one over the other, what we start to do is when knowledge systems come together in their own way and with their own truths, you start to create new knowledge from the relationship between them, not merely one that swallows another. And so that's what we think about when we look at enduring knowledge systems. And if we go back to that map, 120,000 years of practice would suggest that we don't devour our neighbours. We don't devour the knowledge systems that sit over that boundary or from one end of the country to the other. What we do is we relate to them as knowledge systems rather than a series of cultural practices. And we know that where those boundaries are shared, and not just physical boundaries, not just rivers, not just mountains, but where knowledge relates to each other at those interfaces is what actually stabilises that relationship, so that there's parts where knowledge actually has mutual understanding and it's not consumptive. What happens when you do come together and you've got those knowledge systems in place and practice? It fundamentally stabilises what's on the majority, what's on either side. So what we do is we think about these spaces as spaces of knowledge exchange, not merely knowledge extraction or consumption. So when we think about what we do in an ethical framework, it is to ask, how do we actually not consume other knowledges? How do we relate? How do we exchange knowledge? And this is really what we think about when we talk about Indigenous ways of being. But there are characteristics that would be familiar to you all as researchers or people involved in research and research integrity and research ethics. But the characteristics of Indigenous knowledge systems aren't merely about knowledge. They're the ability to actually understand who has been practicing knowledge and knowledge exchange and the evolution of knowledge systems. So what we say is that based on what we know, Indigenous knowledge systems have these themes: a continuation over deep time. And deep time means something more than just 10,000 years. We're talking about significant climatic engagement. There are creation stories, there are knowledge stories that are from the Queensland area of Australia, so the north part of the eastern seaboard, that talks about when the Great Barrier Reef was land as a way of knowing. We're talking about relationships between the coast of Australia, and there's one in Quandamooka and Walpiri, which are nations that are 2,000 kilometres apart, with about 30 nations in between. And yet they have a same creation story about a carpet snake. And when we start to interrogate that over science, we go, where was that relationality? How does that get practiced? And what we do know now is that there's an underwater lake and river that goes from the seaboard out at Quandamooka or Stradbroke Island and comes out in the central desert. So these things are imbued with a storytelling mechanism. They're not merely a creation story that solidifies us as cultural beings. They're scientific validation. How does somebody 2,000 kilometres away, 120,000 years ago, relate to, through a significant, similar, if not the same, story about their creation and one of the things that those nations are to stabilise, without actually going, that's validation, because it's the practice. There's an ethical dimension. There's actually understanding what it's for. So we've got all of these abilities to tell stories, but what Paul and Dan have made me understand is how we tell those stories in ways that actually don't make it sound like it's actually a creation or a cultural story, but it's actually about research validation. And there is lots of examples that we're starting to see. Kinship systems. Everybody goes, oh, that's such a nice cultural way of being, without actually understanding, you know, that kinship systems are basically the first genetic study of humanity. Our kinships and who we our kinship systems are not merely about which clan that you are allowed to be part of. It's basically about understanding the genetic pool of your nation. Everybody wants to dress it up as, oh, you know, that's your first cousin, you can't marry them for a reason, because they're the sort of, well, for us it's Turtle Clan, or it might be a Wombat clan. But really what it was and is the first deep understanding of the Human Genome Project. Not any mapping it anymore. We can actually tell stories about who's related to who, what will happen in the genetic pool if things occur. So when we actually think about these things as science, we've got to actually start to go, it's not merely what is known, it is the practice of how it can be known, why it's known, ongoing validation, who gets to actually be the gatekeepers of that knowledge. Because it's not always, in our world, it's not always about who can know the knowledge. Western conceptions of, you know, or modern research ethical frameworks is that knowledge should be allowed to be accessed by all. And in our practice, we go, do we? Do we really want everybody to know everything? And does everybody really need to know everything? Because it comes back to that fundamental question about research integrity and trust. Our systems are built on who can hold knowledge. Not everybody can hold it. But what we trust in is that everybody's bit of knowledge that they know is validated and is actually understood, creates a wholeness. Remember, it goes back to this idea of the integrity of the system as a whole, rather than the opportunity for everybody to know everything, because that's a burden, right? Who really wants to know everything? and who can know everything. But this idea of the practices of these things, what is authorship and what is authority? Because as we start to practice with modernity, we start to see who gets to actually... Oh, I've got 8 minutes. We get to see this idea of who can we say what to and when that supports an overall contribution to something new, but without having to offer it up in total. Because we know as a matter of integrity, that just doesn't work for us. We always think of... Are there any archaeologists in the room? Oh, good, so I can slight them very badly. But I usually say that about people from Western Australia. But we're not going to go there. Kinship systems, but when we think about what is rock art, archaeologists lose their mind over, oh my God, there's people been painting on rocks for 60,000 years, this is wonderful. When for us it was a moment in time. It was technology at one moment. But what has remained as an integrity of that system is who can know those stories, because they have been passed on, because not everybody knows the story of rock art. But in this idea, it was this ongoing validation that, oh my God, humans have been here for a long time. In our world, it's like, oh, here you are thinking this is something you've discovered, when in fact it's just been a practice. Rock art was a technology. It still remains a technology. But it remains a technology of knowledge, but what is worth saying. Because not all of our stories were put onto rock art or into caves that allowed newcomers to be excited that they're validating our stories that go back tens of thousands of years. But it is about thinking about the practices of all of these knowledge systems over time. So you think about what are some of the principles and the practices. You can start to see really what is contained in the way that we understand our world as researchers within the university, 5 minutes left, researchers within society. But the value of what Indigenous knowledge systems, wherever they are, offer isn't, here you go, have our practices. What we offer is the ability to say what you're experiencing is not new. It might be new for right now, but when you actually think of temporality, we get a better understanding of practice. You know, the last 25 years is not for Indigenous peoples around the world this idea of it's new. It's a blip. It's a microcosm. It's a microsecond. It's a nanosecond if you can use... I don't understand science. I'm a lawyer. So I think what's bigger, smaller, nano or micro? Nano's smaller. Right, it's a nanosecond. But you see what we're talking about. We understand as a matter of practice the decisions we take today, the knowledge that we accumulate today must have an effect across 7 generations. The Native Nations Institute out of the University of Arizona, which started off as the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development, started to validate how decisions around the stabilisation of the societies themselves occurs over 7 generations. So what we know today is informed by 3 generations past, and it will be known 3 generations into the future. So when we think about time, 3 minutes left, all right, I only really need to get my skates on. We think about, we've had a lot of practice of knowledge exchange, not just across time, now we're talking about generations, and across institutions. So really what we're saying is, how do we conduct our research with integrity now? not we as Indigenous, but you as non-Indigenous. And how can we, as Indigenous populations the world over, support non-Indigenous peoples, researchers and research institutions into ways that they can trust that their decisions, that your decisions taken now, can be trusted over time. Not just within one journal, not within, just your lifetime, your academic lifetime, but across generations, and how all this feels to the humanity. Like I said, it should make us pause and consider what we've taken for granted as practices, which is, it's not always about us. It's not always about us, as in you. It's not always about your conduct of research, the ethics that you have about it. There is always a broader context of which that we can borrow from the world's oldest knowledge systems about the practice of research integrity. And like we said, we might think that this actually offers us solutions, but one of those solutions has been a practice of non-Indigenous people is just tell us what you do and we'll replicate it. You consume us. You consume our knowledges, and you do so for the central good. But it's an excitement, right? That's not a bad call out. I mean, genocide's bad, so we shouldn't go there. But the ability to actually practice our knowledge systems, and how do we evolve and maintain at the same time, not just tradition, but the stabilisation, is based in research. Research is the advancement of knowledge itself, but for purpose. That's what we offer. So instead of actually thinking about research knowledge or knowledge as something that is to be consumed, one of the questions that we offer as a practice over time is, how do we exchange knowledge that advances us all, not merely consumes us all? And if we've actually got this last minute, which is, I'm getting I've got a red time up. Ooh. It's not about taking from our knowledge systems. And like I said to you, we have been practicing these knowledges in a state of evolution and adaptation for 120,000 years. It's about recognising that those systems have integrity. And one of those ways that recognise it is because it's still here. You cannot have enduring knowledge systems without a clear understanding of it is what you're doing. Otherwise, we'd probably be a lot like some other extinct societies. But the last point is the most important one, and that is where I round it off as the offer. And this is where I hope that we can start to think about that Indigenous knowledge systems have practices and principles not only that have integrity, that those practices and principles combined with your ways of knowledge are ways that we can further better research integrity. And on that, I will end because I'm going to get into trouble. So thank you so much. Thank you to Nick and Tony for the opportunity. Thanks so much.